We all have different family stories and relationships that make an impact on who we are and what we do. Sometimes it can feel like we're born on third base, and other times it's like we're behind the eight ball with an unfair disadvantage. In the case of Jimmy McGill, it's a little bit of both. His parents, from what we can tell, were loving and supportive. As we find out later, his mom loved his sense of humor and might have preferred him to his brother Chuck, and his dad, while a bit of a sucker, seemed like he was trying to be a good dad to Jimmy. From what we can tell, there wasn't any big issues from his parents that hampered him later on in life. Yet the same cannot be said about his older brother, Chuck. Chuck was a tremendous success as a lawyer, while Jimmy was doing low-level cons with his longtime friend Marco. While Chuck was becoming a partner at a law firm, Jimmy was selling fake Rolexes. Yet when Jimmy hit rock bottom and ended up in jail as a result of that infamous Chicago sunroof, his relationship with Chuck changed.
He defecated through a sunroof!
Instead of having a successful brother living in another state, Jimmy moved with Chuck to Albuquerque. And when that happened, their relationship really morphed into more of a mentor and mentee type of relationship. Jimmy started working in the mailroom and soon got the bright idea to become a lawyer himself, following in his brother's footsteps. As much as we can and will say negative things about Chuck, in some fashion at that time, he served as an inspiration for Jimmy to become a lawyer and truly apply himself in life. Sure, he was not the loving and supportive brother we wish Jimmy would have had, but in this specific instance, he did become an inspiration. And a positive inspiration at that. Yet at some point, Chuck developed an illness, a condition that again changed his relationship with Jimmy. And in season 1, episode 5 titled Alpine Shepard Boy, we see how this new relationship dynamic affects Jimmy in a negative way, and it contributes to the deterioration of their relationship.
Want to talk about this?
The episode starts with 2 police officers approaching Chuck's house after the neighbor reported Chuck stole their newspaper. The police officers see the ripped wires in his house, especially in the back of his house, and they demand that Chuck open the door because they're concerned about him. Chuck requests that no tasers enter the house. He hears the police officers breaking down the door, and he has an episode that puts him in the hospital. When Jimmy arrives, he has to embrace a new role that he has with his brother, the role of a caretaker. With that new role comes new responsibilities. And is Jimmy really ready for these responsibilities? Do these responsibilities trigger Jimmy into making worse decisions for himself and for Chuck? Jimmy enters the hospital room, immediately turns off the electricity, and explains Chuck's condition to the doctor, but the doctor is not buying it. She thinks that this is a made-up illness. She puts a pager in the bed full of batteries to show that Chuck does not notice it. Of course, Jimmy locks this piece of knowledge away for future use, as this tactic provides foreshadowing for Season 3, Episode 5, Chicanery, when Jimmy has Huel place a charged cell phone in Chuck's suit jacket unbeknownst to Chuck. But back to the hospital. Jimmy is outraged at the doctor, calls this a dirty trick, but the doctor says, and I'll play this quote now,
"This allergy to electricity isn't real. It's a manifestation of something deeper."
When Jimmy says that Chuck will never go to a rubber room, the doctor asks him if he's giving up, and Jimmy says,
I'm the one doing the heavy lifting here. That white gas he was talking about, who do you think brings him that?
At this moment, Jimmy's responsibilities to his brother could not have been higher. He isn't just bringing ice cubes to Chuck's house, he's making major healthcare decisions that will have a dramatic effect on their relationship both now and in the future. The doctor asks, quite sternly,
Is that helping or enabling?
She then foreshadows what's going to happen in the future. Ignoring this won't make it go away.
Coleman lanterns indoors, a camp stove. He could burn his house down.
We all know how that ends. Despite the doctor's recommendation, Jimmy doesn't know what to do. He asks Kim what she would do, and she says that she's not sure, but she knows that Chuck needs help. Jimmy ignores both of them. He says it's time to untie Chuck, and he's going to bring him home. Now, it's hard to state what would have happened to Chuck in an alternate universe where Jimmy commits him temporarily to a facility that can try and get him the help that he needs. But Jimmy, in his role as caretaker, makes the decision that he knows that Chuck wants.
Taking my brother home.
Chuck does not want a facility or a padded room. In his mind, he has a real condition that hampers his daily life, and he wants people to know that he is not crazy.
You think I'm crazy?
Maybe Jimmy can't stand the thought of disappointing Chuck. Maybe he felt like another facility or treatment center would be pointless, or maybe he truly believed that Chuck didn't need more help. Whatever the case, I think it's clear that the doctor was right when she said ignoring this would not make it go away, which is exactly what Chuck and Jimmy did for the next, 2.5 seasons. They ignored this. In addition, Jimmy acquiescing to Chuck's demands here didn't even bolster their relationship. We can see the tension between them in the very next scene. Jimmy and Chuck arrive at home, and Jimmy confronts Chuck about the newspaper when Jimmy says,
Whenever you think I've done something wrong, you get worse.
Jimmy thinks that this whole episode that Chuck had is the result of Chuck discovering Jimmy's billboard scheme, which made front page news. Jimmy, of course, staged a worker to fall off the billboard only to have Jimmy save him while his journalist crew recorded the whole thing. Yet Chuck doesn't want to agree with that line of thinking because then it would give credence to the idea that Chuck's condition is mental. But to Chuck, his condition is a real physical one. It's not in Chuck's head. And so he says he got sick because he went outside, i.e. a physical illness, not because he was upset with Jimmy's creative promotion, which would be a mental illness. Jimmy will not let it go and insist,
On the up and up, okay? I will be good. Slippin' Jimmy, he's back in Cicero, dead and buried.
and Chuck responds,
Okay.
We'll see.
We know that Jimmy ultimately does not change. He's not able to live up to the weight of being Chuck's caretaker while at the same time seeking Chuck's approval in his law career. It's too much for him to handle, and he slowly spirals for the next 6 seasons on the show. Now, there's another point that I wanted to weave in here, and that's how Jimmy and Chuck allow each other to make or to not make certain decisions. This was pointed out in a Better Call Saul philosophy book. I'll put the link down below, but I highly recommend the book. The point of it in this one instance is this. At the hospital, Jimmy releases Chuck to his home because he says that that's what Chuck would want. So when Jimmy's dealing with Chuck, he's often trying to fulfill Chuck's wishes of what he wants, even if it's not necessarily what Jimmy wants, i.e. he's trying to allow Chuck the autonomy to make decisions for himself. But the author of one of these chapters in the Better Call Saul philosophy book says the same is actually not true when it comes to Chuck respecting Jimmy's wishes. One example is that as we find out when Jimmy works his way up to pass the bar and he finds a great case to bring to HHM, Chuck vetoes Jimmy working at HHM. Now, if you are giving an extremely charitable version of this event to Chuck, you might say that Chuck just wants Jimmy to become his own man, and that's why Chuck doesn't want Jimmy to go to HHM. I do not personally believe that. I think it's far too generous to Chuck, but it's an argument you could make. But the point is that Chuck here makes that decision for Jimmy. He does not allow Jimmy the autonomy of making his own decision the same way that Jimmy allowed Chuck to make his own decisions with his wishes at the hospital. So while Jimmy is letting Chuck make decisions about his own life, Chuck is imposing what he thinks is best for Jimmy's life. While I'm not sure that we can pinpoint this hospital as a singular defining moment of their relationship, I do think it's a perfect example of the unhealthy, unequal, and toxic relationship that Chuck and Jimmy had with each other that ultimately was too much for Jimmy to handle and absolutely contributed to his downward spiral that we see in Better Call Saul. That's all I've got for this episode. I'll get back to Season 1, Episode 6 next time. See you later.